Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I didn't book the cruise for adventure. I booked it to rest the part of my brain that checks doors twice and counts minutes between calendar alerts. The MV Pacific Aurora looked like the answer to that. White hull catching morning sun in Honolulu. Red bands around the stacks tidy as a barber's pole. I took a window cabin, threw my single duffel on the bunk, and promised myself I would not think about schedules or structures. For the first 2 days, I kept that promise. You can forget your life when the sea is endless, and the only decisions are which deck chair to choose and whether to add ginger to your tea. The crowd on board came from everywhere. A robotics teacher from Busan explained to a Tahitian mother how she printed little plastic gears for her students. An elderly couple from Tacoma played cribbage with a German pair on sabbatical. A Samoan cook named Noah turned out pancakes the color of sunsets thanks to purple yam. I introduced myself as a civil engineer from Seattle, bridges and site work mostly, taking a break before the next contract. The captain's noon announcements had a calm weight to them. He mentioned trade winds at 15 knots and a gentle west-northwest set. We cut blue water like a chalk line. On the 6th night, the captain didn't speak at noon. Rumour among crew said maintenance on the bridge radios. Not unusual. The ship kept breathing. A hum under the feet. A slight sway that rocks fear to sleep if you let it. At sunset, I walked the promenade with a paper cup of weak tea. On the horizon to starboard, a crown of low cloud sat wrong, as if the sky had borrowed an atoll's shape. The observation lounge's chart display showed our position sweeping close to an unlabeled grid cluster north of our original route. Electronic charts prefer numbers to names where history went sour. I recognized the pattern anyway. Old proving grounds. Low islands with concrete bones, the kind of places people remember from black and white photos of flashbulb clouds. That night in my cabin, the ship shivered once, then hard enough to knock the cup off the desk. The corridor lights shifted to amber. A voice came through the PA, clipped and precise. "This is the bridge. All passengers return to your cabins. Crew stand by. This is not a drill. Not a drill gives you a minute of false comfort, because it means someone is steering the moment. After that, the body catches up to the truth, and every bulkhead is a shoreline." The Aurora tilted to port. A second alarm, slower and lower, started pulsing through the deck plates. I took my duffel, passport, and the soulless orange life jacket with its hard collar and whistle, and went for muster station C. Crew moved fast without yelling. A junior officer with a Polish flag pin on her lapel used a loud hailer like a conductor. "Hands on the rail, keep to your lanes." The night smelled of machine oil and salt. Through a gap, I saw a white stripe of breaking sea where no wave should have been. A reef. The lifeboat did not want to leave the first time. Falls tangled, and then a sailor coaxed them free, the way you talk a stubborn door back into the world of hinges. I got into LC2 because arithmetic demanded a body for a seat, and mine was nearest. We kissed the swell less gracefully than the training videos, and backed away on the painter line until a knife said the word that means go. We watched our hotel town lean. The hull made the kind of sound that belongs to cold dawns in dry docks, not nights at sea. She didn't plunge. She settled, stern-kissing reef, bow stubborn against dark water. The EPA blinked and blinked like patience can replace a rescue. The sky turned from black to slate behind a shoulder of palms. Lifeboats drifted into an unplanned constellation. By daylight, we were among low islands that looked like they'd been placed by an absent-minded god from a pocket full of green coins. 2 showed concrete shapes, old towers, a half dome, the square mouths of bunker doors. One larger island to our west wore an uninterrupted crown of trees and sand bright as bone. A pass cut the reef like a doorway. A former longliner among us, Kaito Sato, read the swell and the colour and took us in exactly where the water wanted us. We came ashore not as castaways in stories do, running, whooping, hugging sand, but quietly, the way you enter someone else's house when you've been told the owner is away, but you still knock. There was a spring 10 minutes inland where water whispered out of volcanic rock into a shallow pool. We tested it with a handheld kit, turbidity low, pH acceptable, and boiled anyway. Under ironwood trees, we stacked platforms and crosspieces into sleeping decks. We named the spring First Water. Names are anchors. They tell your mind where to turn when the ocean of unknown pulls at it. We counted ourselves and accepted the numbers. 32 encamped by dusk, including crew and tourists. The doctor, Mateo Alvarez, an ER physician, set up a clean ground with a tarp, a wash station, and a box that held suture, gauze, a tourniquet, saline, and gloves. Asha Banerjee, an electrical engineer with a headlamp wrapped around her wrist like a bracelet, combed the lifeboats for batteries and cable. She and a robotics teacher named Li Mei built a charge controller from diodes and Ingenuity and set 2 marine solar panels on a bamboo frame. Kaito tuned the lifeboat engine by listening, cowling off, fingers at the intake as if reading Braille. Noah built a kitchen under a tarpaulin with a rocket stove of stones. We walked a perimeter and drew rules in the sand, the way you start a blueprint with a sketch. 1 fire, latrine downwind with ash bucket. Watch at all hours. Water only from First Water unless boiled. Shoes off in the medical area. Rationing on a posted board so everyone can subtract with their eyes. A teacher from Tacoma named Harper wrote a schedule on a plank. Reading hour, knots lesson, bird names. Children sat on rolled mats and listened with hands folded. Stability sounds like a teacher's voice on a beach. Night brings back all the things sunlight holds off. On the horizon to the east, across low islands with concrete bones, a faint artificial glow pulsed and then steadied. It wasn't city light, it was the wrong color. A steady promise instead of a human flicker. Bioluminescence stitched the surf white-blue where waves turned back on themselves. Talia Ritchie, a botanist who had been on a field trip before cruise time turned into a lifeboat, stood beside me and said the simplest, hardest thing. Those will be the dark islands. She didn't say nuclear. She didn't have to. The words test site live in a tone more than in syllables. Work assigned itself to hands next morning. Asha and Li Mei finished the charge controller. We tested the handheld GPS and salvaged sat phone. Coaxed the latter back from its salt bath by drying it in rice like a folk remedy for electronics. Kaito took a small team to the reef pass, found the channel by reading the mouths of waves. Noah inventoried rice and biscuits, set a board with chalk lines for portions. Talia walked with a notebook, tapping leaves with a pencil and saying names like cordyline and hibiscus, tiliaceus, and terminalia catappa. I built towers out of ironwood and bamboo, triangulated braces because triangles are the shape that admits gravity is relentless and then makes an agreement with it. We hung bells made from the cut bottoms of propane canisters, clappers tied with line. 1 tone meant look, 3 meant come. A cascade was run. We found taro under heart-shaped leaves and breadfruit that took roasting to turn from rock to bread. We built a fish weir at low tide, a V of rocks that let small fish slip out and asked larger ones to stay. We caught goatfish and parrotfish and a small trevally. We learned that ciguatera sits in certain fish and certain places and makes people dizzy, so we learned slowly, sampling with caution, watching for warning signs, choosing herbivores and smaller sizes, taking notes as carefully as a lab. On the 9th day, the tide rolled in a crewman. Foam outlined him and then receded. We moved him up the beach with care and respect and didn't speak much. We buried him near ironwoods where roots held earth together. We marked the grave with driftwood. Names would come later if they came at all. The next morning, at dawn, we found human footprints that walked away from a similar tide line, circled under ironwood needles, and stopped where there should have been more tracks. The mind wants explanations that fit habits. Kaito touched the prints and said he stood here. In screw pine, we found life jacket foam with crescent teeth marks. Fear is worse unsaid. We said it out loud on the path. A person came out of the water or from the shore and didn't walk like people do. We set trip lines and shell chimes along paths. Li Mei rigged a smoke detector buzzer to a tensioned wire so a touch would chirp. We listened to our own camp as if it were a forest. That night, the shell chimes sang softly in sequence. A man in a crew polo walked into the opening with a kind of aimless purpose. He pressed his forehead to the bell like a moth to light. His eyes looked like windows in an empty house. We guided, not fought. Net first, over shoulders, down arms, around knees, pikes horizontal like gates, a harpoon butt to pin mesh to sand, voices low. He leaned where we placed the pole. He went towards sound when the wind jostled the bell. We guided him down the beach the way a river guides a leaf set into its gentle edge. On wet sand, the surf's hush held him. At dawn, he stopped moving, the way someone falling asleep gives up at last. We waited hours. The flies told a fact his skin did not. We did what fire is for in places like this. We made heat and smoke and stood downwind with masks wet from boiled water. We didn't speak during the combustion. Afterward, voices returned like birds. There's a piece of you that wants a neat label for phenomena that make no sense at first frame. We called it auditory fixation. The change derived, drawn to the hum of a bell, the drone of a generator, the steady tone of a ventilator fan in a building across on a dark island. They moved with a heavy gait, like carrying a refrigerator nobody told them to put down. They didn't lunge, they didn't speak. The worst of our scenes were quiet. The sea became a courier. A storm east of the dark islands rearranged driftwood and memory, pulling free debris and bodies from flats that hadn't had their measure taken in a long time. Single arrivals came first, then pairs, then 10 in a morning on rafts of pallets and hatches. At the beach mouths, we hung net curtains on release lines and pulled them down when bells called. We learned the timing of our small battlefield. Tripline chatter, net drop, pike to hold, hook to guide ankles and hips away from living space. We didn't waste words like bravado. Method, not heroics, keeps people breathing. Everything else had to keep pace. The garden grew. Sweet potato, taro, pumpkin on a living fence where vines slowed anything that dragged a foot. Breadfruit roasted in pits with hot stones and cooled into slices we dried into hard chips. We built more towers and made their ladders pull up on cords. We dampened camp noise the way libraries do, cloth under pot handles, rope around bell ropes, rubber from salvage fins under table legs. The watch language got sophisticated. 1 tone for single, 2 for pair, 3 for group, a fast roll to say run to the safe line behind the second fence. Even order needs inputs from elsewhere. The lifeboat engine coughed more than we liked. Our meds were close to bottom, where antibiotics and saline count. The sat phone could whisper text if we kept it fed, but voices died in static. The only hardware store within reach lay across a line of wind and water where concrete and bad history shared ground. We discussed it as a circle, not as a pronouncement. This was not television, where a lone leader decides on a cliff with a 1,000-yard stare. We passed around the pocket dosimeter we had found in a lifeboat locker, watched the needle sit near background, and told ourselves, dose, distance, time. We would keep time short, distance long from hotspots, dose monitored. We would land only where wind and meter agreed. We would aim for structures that could hold kits labelled Med or Elec. Dawn Run, Kaito at tiller, Asher with the meter, Talia with sample bags and labels, Noah with food, and eyes that see what others miss. Me with a rope bag and a crowbar we'd hammered straight on a stone and tempered in coals. The first 2 islets were scrub and turns. The third had the look you know from photos, concrete slabs, a dome, rusted towers, a pier with bites out of it where waves had loved it too hard for years. Asher read air dose, a bit above background at the shoreline, more near a drainage ditch, back down in the lee of a slab. We stayed on concrete where we could, stepping over sea grape and fragments. The storehouse door held out until the crowbar reminded it of leverage. Inside was silence with dust in it. We found crates with faded stamps, Med on grey wood, Elec on olive drab. The generator in the corner wore a tag that Noah blessed under his breath. We took what a field hospital asks for: saline, hemostatic gauze, suture, gloves, tape, and the tools that make life easier: gaskets, a spare carb diaphragm, hose clamps, wire, a small box of fuses. We moved fast. The meter ticked up near a corner. We took the other path. We left a note in a zip bag on the shelf. Desperate use. Survivors to the west. Thank you. It felt like a necessary apology. On the pier, the wind turned, and the meter crept toward the part of the scale you don't like. Boat, Asher said. We were extra rude to the throttle on the way out, and the engine forgave us. Back home, we disinfected boxes and sorted like a small clinic. The iodine we'd found was tincture, not pills, but there are ways to use what you have if you know what not to do. We conserved antibiotics and used liters of boiled water on coral scrapes. We traded fatigue carefully. Heavy for 3 days meant light for 2, because exhaustion stacks like bad math. When the change came in groups, our beach plan worked until it didn't. One afternoon, a storm shouldered the reef and gave us 11 at once on 4 rafts. Nets dropped, pikes placed, hooks guided. A ladder came down accidentally, and 2 climbers reached halfway up a tower before Asher and I hauled it back up, and the climbers fell without catching themselves. It took breath, not bravado, to finish that hour. Afterward, camp sat in a circle in the after-rain glow. Harper told a story about Pacific navigators who read swell with their bodies, the way a canoe tells you what an island is doing to water far away. We don't inherit those skills by accident, but the thought that humans can do difficult things with patience felt like someone putting a jacket over the shoulders of our nerves. Every day without a radio reply is 2 days long. Twice a day, we said our pan-pan on channel 16, gave coordinates, asked for relay or receipt, static. The sat phone sent text to numbers that might have been disconnected or just silenced at the far end. We kept doing it. The repetition is part of survival. So is ritual. We wrote names on a board every evening. We crossed none off because crossing off is wrong when you don't know. The quiet scenes were the hardest. The morning Mr. Coe woke at dawn, walked to the fence, and stood facing the sea without speaking. The afternoon, Yegor Kovalenko and his wife, Anya, decided they would sleep in the tower, and I argued and then compromised by building a small platform halfway up for them, with a split coil of rope as a hammock so no ladder would be down at night. The evening, Asher and I counted fuel hours on a log, and both did the same math for how many runs to the dark islands we could afford before the engine economy made decisions for us. The night a child's cough turned rattly, and Matteo spent 2 hours steaming a towel and feeding a cup with a spoon worth of honey we'd stewed from sugar and water until the cough softened again. We learned we could move a changed person out of camp quieter by giving them a sound to follow than by pushing with poles. A low hum on a small speaker moved them like a busker's tune, moves pigeons. We hid the speaker inside a bucket at the edge of a path and strung it to a battery pack and a switch with a long cord. Lee May made a little board that pulsed a tone, soft and steady. It felt like cheating to guide an empty house of a person with a sound that they couldn't stop noticing, but it saved hands and skin. There were bad hours. One of them began with the West Bell at noon, 3 tones turning into a panicked roll. Debris and people arrived together on a tide thick with foam. The net jammed at one corner and would not drop. I ran to unstick it, and a pair of hands closed on the net's far edge. In my periphery, those hands were just hands, but the weight behind them was a person who didn't know where their weight was. Noah's harpoon butt swung down between arms and net like a gate. The hook in my left hand found an ankle, and the person went down slowly, as if sitting where a bus asked. Nothing bit me. Nothing raked me. The fear of it washes over in a curl you have to walk through and trust your body will find breath on the other side. When it was over, I found I'd driven the hook into the sand deep enough to hit coral. We lost a lifeboat that week. A storm took it off its mooring during an anchor reset and shoved it onto the reef teeth down. The air that had felt like a background hum in camp suddenly became something we noticed, a purposeful part of life. How the hours felt longer without the comfort of knowing an engine could carry you somewhere not here if all else failed. We replaced equipment with craft. We built outriggers on a sailing canoe from storm-thrown poles and shaped paddles from a door. We made a sail from 2 mattress covers stitched together with hibiscus fiber. Technique lives longer than gear. I felt that lesson, the way you feel a bruise when you lean against a door jamb. It would be easy to say the changed were a wave and we were a shore, but shore and wave are both water in the end. They were people whose brains had been shifted from usual tracks by a combination we didn't fully understand. Time in water, something environmental from test islands carried by wind and fog, an injury we couldn't see, perhaps a pathogen that liked to move where sound lived. Matteo refused to fill blanks with guesswork, he observed. Bite incidents led to fever in less than a day, and then a stupor that either resolved or did not. Scratches without deep penetration inflamed, but did not lead to the same pattern if cleaned thoroughly and flushed. He kept a ledger like a ledger saves lives. He drew careful lines between correlation and cause. Where he didn't know, he said, "I don't know." You can build a town on those words. The bigger ones, like certainty, crumble under rain. By the time the first thick fog rolled across from the dark islands, we had convinced ourselves we could read the sea the way old navigators did. The fog proved we were apprentices at best. It arrived at dusk like a guest who found your address without a map, low and purposeful, smelling of salt and something metallic you taste on the back of your tongue. The dosimeter ticked up in air just enough to make Asha frown and hang a cloth over her mouth. Sound changed. It does that in fog, turns small noises into a room's hum. The bell sounded farther. The bucket speaker led 2 changed into a holding area and then died with a soft electrical sigh. We adjusted. That's all you do. 100 small turns of the wrist to keep a vessel off rocks. We held through the fog night by stacking quiet on quiet. We lined paths with palm fronds to dampen footfalls. We put felt under ladder steps. We kept children in the safest center of camp, wrapped 3 sides with woven mats and a 4th with a woven story. Harper talked softly through hours about how people long ago learned to watch the shape of clouds on horizons, to know land was there before they could see it. The batteries gave us 3 hours of steady light at the kitchen. After that, we went to lanterns made from a small flame under a glass with holes. Fog made halos out of everything. A changed woman stood at the outer fence and held her palm an inch from a line of wire. Fascinated by the hum we had forgotten was there, from the inverter mounted on the post. We cut the inverter and the hum stopped, and so did she, as if someone had paused her. Fog thinned before dawn and left a taste like chewing on a coin. The dosimeter needle eased back toward background. That morning, we finally got a reply on the radio. A voice with a clipped Australian accent came back like a ghost from a long tunnel. "Station calling, say again last." We said again. We gave coordinates. We got a relay. Small aircraft overhead in 2 days if weather permits. Water and med drop. The camp became a town by lunchtime. The way people stood a little straighter and found reasons to fix things they had been tolerating. We painted a crude H on the sand with pulverized shell and seawater, a marker for the drop. We tied strips of white cloth in ironwood so wind direction would show from the air. We wrote help and a smile symbol next to it, because small humor is an energy source. The aircraft came late by our watches and exactly on time by aviation standards. A twin turboprop so far up it looked like a line on paper, then a shape, then a voice on the handheld telling us to stand clear. 2 pallets under parachutes fell with the grace of careful calculation, landed in the lagoon and drifted, and we launched the canoe and a skiff together to reach them. The pallets held water pouches, carbide-bladed knives still oiled in paper, trauma dressings, a case of high-calorie ration bars, a small solar charging kit better than our self-made one, and a letter in plastic with a map of known rescue operations. 3 frequencies to monitor, an advice that sounded like our last month. Avoid drift from east after storms. Avoid fog from east. Avoid downwind of test sites in low pressure. Keep to leeward of islands with concrete ruins. Cook fish thoroughly. Report bites immediately. It ended with a line that made the camp hold still on the inside. Confirmed reports of reanimation events in multiple locations. Avoid large sound sources. Do not gather in stadiums or near broadcasting infrastructure. The pilot banked once, rocked wings, and left us with the sound of propellers fading into the blue. It is hard to keep your world small enough to manage and big enough to remain a world. The pallets broadened ours without making it too heavy to carry. We fixed the ladder on Tower 3 with a real hinge and a pin instead of a lashing. We swapped makeshift conductors in the charge controller for proper ones. We put aside 2 boxes labelled "Nevertheless" for things you keep, to remind yourself that luck is a partner you don't get to choose. We moved some sleeping platforms inland a few meters to keep fog from sitting on people's lungs in low spots. The school's plank got a new lesson: how to say aerodynamics in 3 languages. We did not get a ship, we got a network. Twice a day the radio gave us voices. Sometimes they were relays from yachts, sometimes islanders like us. News came in pieces. A coastal city closed its airport to everything but med flights. A naval vessel quarantined its own lower decks. A chain of islands to the south built a ferry corridor with taped-over beacons and paper signs that said "quiet route." The word outbreak drifted across all of it like a worn sail. Nobody said end. People said hold and learn and make again. We learned to sharpen ironwood with water on coral and made edges that could be renewed instead of replaced. We shaped hooks from stainless steel and kept them in a jar of oil. We made a small forge from clay and a pipe so we could heat and bend hardware. We braided hibiscus fibre into line that didn't bite hands as hard as twine. We discovered that sea almond leaves made decent plates if you scored the midrib. We grew a taste for breadfruit chips because taste follows discipline if you feed it long enough. There was one more run to the Dark Islands that mattered more than the rest. The generator we had rescued coughed and then ran sweet for 2 weeks. Long enough to teach us that coffee from a percolator under a canvas roof during rain is close to proof of civilization. A bearing in its pull start gave out, a small part that becomes a gating factor for good mood as easily as a lack of sleep does. We had alternatives. Rope around the flywheel, a hand crank we shaped from an old winch handle, but the bearing lived in a storehouse we had sprinted through last time because our meter had gone up and our wind had turned. The morning we went back, the sea looked like poured glass. Flat days are suspicious. Waves tell you what water is thinking. Kaito accounted for the longshore drift with his eyes. Ashes set the decimeter on the bow with a zip tie so she could read it hands-free and keep her hands on the rope and her mind on the map inside her head. Talia brought tags and bags and eucalyptus oil under her nose for the smell of closed places. Noah packed rice cakes with dried fish and a smile that said it's a small thing but it helps. We went fast, stepping on concrete where we could. The bearing lay in a drawer labelled with a stencil older than me. We heard a low hum at the far end of the storehouse, faint and even. We froze, then realised it was a fan in some enclosured room still turning on residual power from something we couldn't see. The meter ticked up near that room and we backed away. We left with the bearing and a gasket kit and 2 spools of heavy wire. On the pier, fog threatened in the east but wind breathed off the lagoon toward us. We read the direction from strips of white cloth someone had tied long ago to an antenna. We thanked them quietly for the advice. We made it home fast enough to feel like we'd stolen time and not had it stolen from us. The generator turned over with a sound like confidence and then settled into a purr that calmed people the way some songs do. We set limits on use the way you ration good coffee, lights for 2 hours after dusk, clinic as needed. A charge on the sat phone where a human voice mattered for 5 minutes. We didn't make the generator the new sun. We had learned not to worship single points of failure. In the end, survival on that island was less about the quiet war at the fence and more about decisions we made when water was plentiful and sky was blue. We made a second garden plot uphill of the first, because we knew that every flood travels downhill. We ran a shallow trench above the camp to catch and divert heavy rain. We built a small smokehouse to keep fish and meat longer, hung them from ironwood dowels that held their shape in heat. We taught everyone how to paddle and how to read a swell and how to right a canoe if a gust caught it wrong. We practiced signals with mirrors in sun, and the children got better at it than we were. We agreed on a simple phrase to decide whether to take a risk. Does this action make us more alive tomorrow without taking too much from today? The change kept coming. Fewer when wind blew steady from the west, more after storms to the east. Fog rolled in twice more in weeks with a metallic edge, and we repeated our routine like a song. Dampen sound, keep children high, minimize time in it, monitor dose, hold until morning. We never saw a glow in a person, not really, not like stories. What glowed was the sea when paddles cut it at night, and the way metal holds certain kinds of light, as if it were a memory. We never saw the aurora again, only pieces of her washed in, a nameplate fragment, a placard with a muster diagram, a cabin key with a number embossed. We kept those pieces on a shelf in the school corner. They were part of the story of how we had come to live where we lived, and of the people who didn't climb into our lifeboat because arithmetic said no. On calm evenings, we said the names we had, and for the ones we didn't, we said the word friend. It's imprecise, and therefore perfectly accurate. Weeks blurred into a calendar of signs. Breadfruit season swell, booby nesting week, turtles on the night beach, lightning far to south like sheet music. We found a rhythm between fence and fishing line, between watch and garden, between wariness and humour. We smiled more with our faces again, not just our voices. Once, Kaito played a tune on a piece of PVC with holes burned into it. It sounded like memory does when you tell it to sit down for a minute and take off its backpack. We had visitors other than the changed. A yacht drifted too close one day, engine quiet. A couple aboard who had managed to keep themselves separate and alive, with canned chickpeas and discipline, but had run out of parts for a raw water pump. We traded gasket material and an hour of labour for a box of spices and paper and a waterproof jacket that fit Matteo perfectly and made him look like he belonged in a boot catalogue. They left us with a hand-drawn map of currents to the south and a short note. There is a small research station 2 days downwind that may still be staffed. The note had a half sentence, and if not, that the writer had scratched out. We saved the paper to teach children about tone. If the story expects a decision about leaving, there isn't one big decision in reality, only a stack of small yeses and not yets that form the shape of a path. We did not build a boat for a grand escape. We improved the canoe, added a better outrigger, stiffer crossbeams, and a mast pocket more secure than lashings alone. We tested the canoe in longer reaches, always keeping the island in sight. We planned a run to the research station and back with a borrowed location from the yacht's map, and the stars if the GPS failed. We told ourselves you don't leave home by refusing to look back. You leave by teaching yourself how to return from a first step. On the evening before the first long test sail, I walked the fence at the west beach. The net curtains hung rolled and ready. The stake line was straight and proud, edges hardened by heat and sand. The ropes had a fine white crust of salt where spray dried. The bells made by propane cylinders were dark against the sky. The sea breathed. The island answered with wind in ironwood needles that sounds like distant rain even when the sky is clear. I thought of the word fortress and then corrected myself. We had not built a fortress. We had built a place that asked the world to be kind and had the decency to ask hard. A shape moved at the edge of water. I lifted the small binoculars we'd repaired with oiled thread and patience. A single person stood on a wooden pallet, riding a lazy swell toward shore, knees flexing just enough to stay upright, arms at sides. There was no drama in it. The person stepped off the pallet when the water reached knees and walked until the fence stopped them. They pressed a cheek to a net and closed eyes, listening to some sound we had forgotten was on. I signalled the tower, single, and a bucket speaker hummed from the path left, a soft tone like a fridge in a quiet night kitchen. The person turned, followed, and I guided them to the corral we kept for moments when time and method were the only generosity we could afford. Later, we did what heat is for. The sky that night had no moon. We didn't need one. We had a chart in our heads we hadn't owned when we left Honolulu. We knew where the spring was without seeing it, how many steps from kitchen to clinic, and how to do it without touching anything. We knew the sail pocket would hold if wind came off the quarter. We knew the soil near the breadfruit stayed damp a day longer than the soil under Pandanus. We knew how to carry someone on a stretcher made from a door with 4 hands and a song, so the person being carried remembered they belonged to something. We knew how to wait for dawn without being unmade by the dark. When the first light came, slate to pearl to the faintest yellow, we pushed the canoe out. Children stood in water to push, because belonging also means effort in shallow water on a morning that matters. The sail went up like a promise you can take back if weather argues. The outrigger kissed waves, lines hummed a little. The mast bent as if nodding yes. We aimed toward a point on a line drawn between a cloud shape and a remembered map. Behind us, on shore, ironwood stirred, as if saying, "We see you." Ahead, we expected nothing, and therefore could welcome anything. If there is a lesson worth speaking in a voice box meant for telling stories later, it's this. The sea does not know what you've been through. It doesn't owe you flat water because you've had storms. Islands do not promise to stay the same shape because your plans like them that way. People aren't heroes because they own knives or pikes or clever wires on trips and bells. They become worth the word because every hour they improve something small and repeat the part that worked and let the part that didn't wash out with the tide. We sailed until the island became a low line behind us, then a suggestion, then only a memory of where to point your heart if a cloud looks wrong. We found the research station squat on a low spit of coral. Whether its doors open to people or only dust, we would do what we had taught ourselves. Stop, listen, read air and ground, move as if tomorrow depends on every contact point with present, because it does. Hoa. The canoe leaned into a slight quartering sea, spray warm on shins. Kaito adjusted the sheet and smiled that sideways smile of a person who prefers a skill to a speech. Asher looked at the meter, then at wind, then at the far line where Sky thought about weather. Talia tied a label to a string and let it dangle like a lazy weather vane. Noah handed me a rice cake and touched the deck with his palm like you pat a dog you love. I thought of first water, and the bells, and the way the changed pressed their cheeks to nets as if listening for a life they had lost, and of our little school, where a teacher taught children to signal with mirrors, because signals are what make distances crossable. I didn't book the cruise for adventure. I didn't book it to build a town or to learn the language of fog, but here we were, breathing in time with waves, working a plan we never asked for as if we had studied for it. The world had been unkind in the way weather can be unkind, impersonal and thorough. We could still answer it with order, with names for leaves, with baskets hung on pegs, with a ferrying of sound from a bucket to a fence to lead a dangerous thing away from where children sleep, with a canoe pointed at a station that might be a door or a wall, ready for either, hands steady on lines. The changed would keep coming. The radio would crackle sometimes with voices and sometimes with a hiss. The garden would yield more in one season and less in another. We would dry fish and tell stories and sharpen wood and talk softly at night. We would make decisions small enough to fit into hands and big enough to grow into futures. We would keep a list of names near the school and add to it when we learned a new one. And for the ones we never learned, we would keep a space that said friend and mean it. I can't tell you if we left for good or learned to treat leaving as a radius. I can tell you we were alive in ways that don't make headlines, that our island smelled of smoke and salt and steamed breadfruit, and the sharp clean of fresh water poured into a pot at dawn. I can tell you the generator purred, and then was silent per our own rules, that the fence did not forget to be a fence. That sound carried differently on nights when fog stayed out at sea. I can tell you the canoe moved well, and the mast sang a little, and the sails, cut from mattress covers and sewn with hibiscus fibre and stubbornness, filled not with hope, which is expensive, but with air, which is free and enough when you know what to do with it. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.